Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy, where we bring you the stories behind the health headlines.
This podcast is brought to you by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Body Cream. 800-345-7339, on the web at uttercream.com. Trillions of bacteria in your digestive tract have to work in harmony to keep you healthy. How balanced is your microbiome? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
When antibiotics, infections, or a rotten diet interfere with the balance of bacteria in the intestines, the results can be devastating. The inner ecosystem has effects on the immune system, as well as digestion and weight. How should we be eating so our friendly flora flourish?
Probiotics are becoming increasingly common. How can they best be used to restore the balance of bacteria in our digestive systems?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, find out how bacteria in the wrong place could be driving heartburn.
First, the news.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines. This week, the World Health Organization declared Zika virus to be a global health emergency. The virus is turning out to be much more widespread than most people realized. It's been detected in 24 countries in the Americas and is found in many parts of Africa and the Pacific Islands. Brazilian health authorities suspect that a visitor from Oceania or Africa was infected when he or she came to the Soccer World Cup in 2014. Doctors in the U.S. have recently confirmed that Zika, which is usually transmitted through mosquito bites, can also be spread through sexual contact. A patient in Dallas, Texas, caught the disease by having sex with an individual who had been traveling in an area where Zika virus is prevalent.
Although the focus has been justifiably on the probable connection between Zika virus infection during pregnancy and the birth defect called microcephaly, there do appear to be other possible complications for adults. In Venezuela and Colombia, health authorities have noted an increase in cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome that they believe is linked to Zika. This neurological condition can sometimes result in long-lasting paralysis. Hearing loss has also been linked to the virus. Although Zika has only been making headlines in the last several weeks, it's clear that this virus has been widespread for many years. Epidemiologists have just begun to recognize the scope of the problem, but we still don't know how far it's spread and the full range of complications that it can cause, both in adults and children. As long as it was considered a tropical disease that affected primarily poor countries and other places, it didn't get the attention we now clearly see it deserves.
Alzheimer's disease is a specter that looms over a graying America. Researchers have been trying to test strategies for prevention, and one such study was reported in the JAMA this week. The Memory and Aging Project of Rush University Medical Center recruited older volunteers from retirement communities and housing projects around Chicago. Those with a gene called ApoE4 are at especially high risk of developing Alzheimer's disease as they age. Autopsies of 286 individuals who died during the study showed that those who ate at least one seafood meal a week were less likely to have the plaques and tangles of Alzheimer's disease if they were positive for ApoE4.
When people hear the word microbiome, they often think of intestinal bacteria. We now know that there are more bacterial cells than human cells in any individual person. What most people don't consider, however, is the microbiome of the skin. We're teeming with microbes adapted to their own particular niche. One place in particular has a rich microbiome, and that is the armpit. This is part of the body that hosts a lot of bacteria, and the ecology of the bacterial communities in the armpit varies greatly between individuals. A study compared bacterial communities between people who use underarm products such as antiperspirants and deodorants and those who do not. There were striking differences. Not only were there many more bacteria in product-free armpits, the mix of species was quite different. Stopping the use of deodorants or antiperspirants resulted in an increase of bacteria that could be cultured. The dominant species still differed from those in armpits not accustomed to hygiene products. The authors are unable to say whether these changes have an impact on human health overall.
Over the last several years, dozens of Indian drug manufacturers have received warnings from the FDA about bad manufacturing practices. In one of the latest incidents, Wockhardt is accused of deleting data and hiding the results of tests that did not turn out as hoped. The company will not be allowed to ship products to the U.S. until it remedies the situation to the FDA's satisfaction. Hundreds of millions of tablets and capsules have been recalled. They include blood pressure pills, amlodipine and lisinopril, the sleeping pill Zolpidem, and an antibiotic called azithromycin. IPCA and Aurobindo have also run into difficulties with the agency. IPCA received a warning letter that will prevent U.S. sales of drugs made in several of its plants. Other Indian drug firms, Dr. Reddy's Laboratories and Sun Pharmaceutical Industries, also got warnings from the FDA late last year. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. There are trillions of bacteria flourishing in our digestive tracts. But when the balance is upset by infections, antibiotics, or a poor diet, the consequences can be devastating. Is there a way to reboot and rebalance the intestinal microbiota so we can regain good health for ourselves and our bacterial communities?
To find out, we turn to Dr. Gerard Mullen. He's an internist, a gastroenterologist, and a nutritionist. Dr. Mullen is an associate professor of medicine at the Johns Hopkins University, where he also directs integrative nutrition services.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Mullen.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Mullen, your book is The Gut Balance Revolution, Boost Your Metabolism, Restore Your Inner Ecology, and Lose the Weight for Good. That all sounds terrific. We do want to learn a little bit about boosting the metabolism, but I think today we really want to focus on restoring your inner ecology. The microbiota of our digestive tracts is increasingly recognized to be important.
Well, if you turn back the clock 10, 15 years and said microbiome, most doctors would look at you like, huh? And certainly patients had never even heard of it. Probiotics were kind of new and different and a little weird. It was like maybe okay in Europe, but here it was like, bugs in your belly? Why should we worry about that? That's all changed. It's a revolution now. Most people have even heard of the term microbiome, and most of your colleagues are quite familiar with it. What brought about this revolution?
I think there's 2 to 3 pivotal events. One, I'll actually go back thousands of years in both the Ayurvedic tradition of medicine and even traditional Chinese medicine. Both forms of medicine view the gut as the window to the body, right? It's your core of health, and many of these practitioners treated the patient through the gut to have achieve superior outcomes. Then come along in the Western forms, you have naturopathic medicine, functional medicine, and many of these doctors also base their practice on this tenet, is treat the gut first. Then comes along Ilya Mechnikov back in the turn of the 20th century. And he's the one who actually is, the person responsible for the turning point, making the observations that Bulgarian farmers who drank fermented milk were healthier and lived longer. And he won the Nobel Prize for his writings, which had to deal with the drinking of fermented milk for longevity. So I think that was, a pivotal turning point, and then what we would call the Human Microbiome Project, much like the Genome Project, is where they utilize the technology in the Genome Project to characterize the microbiota, and we're able, once you can characterize what's there, you can learn a lot about what they're there and how they're functioning.
And now, of course, we recognize that there's probably more bacteria in our digestive tracts than there are cells in our body.
there are 10 times more of our symbiotes in terms of cells and 100 times more DNA. And one scary thought is that there's even more viruses than there are bacteria in our gut. So there's a lot going on there.
All right. Well, tell us a little bit about how we can balance this incredible interior ecology. If we're not feeling well, presumably it's partly because things have gone a little awry there.
Well, there's a lot of things that happen in life that can disturb the integrity of our gut lining and also the balance of our good bacteria. And the antibiotics that either we take or given, right, for different infections, or even the antibiotics perhaps even in our meat, either way, that'll distort the microbiome. The food we eat, there's more and more evidence that the Western-style diet, which really means high fat, high sugar, refined carbohydrates, they shift the microbiome in an adverse way. Now, just like we think about the Amazon rainforest, the more diverse we have of ecology, the better we have in terms of the lives that are available in there, the more they thrive. And the same thing is true in our gut. But when we eat the wrong foods, we minimize the diversity, and you can call them the bad bugs, they tend to thrive in that environment. So in terms of what are we going to do, in functional medicine, there's a rubric about these 4 R's, about trying to get rid of and remove the things that are damaging us. So we would try to minimize our intake of the antibiotics. We also would remove the foods that are triggering a lot of these microbes, the bad microbes, to grow and thrive.
Dr. Mullen, I think our listeners are very familiar with what you're talking about, but their health professionals may not be. So I'm kind of curious. I mean, here you are at Johns Hopkins University, one of the foremost medical centers in the country, and a great medical school. How well is this microbiome stuff being taught in medical school? How well are probiotics being reviewed? How well is everything that you write about in the Gut Balance Revolution being taught to your colleagues?
Well, let me frame it this way, is that there is a microbiome interest group, which is, I would say, headed by the dean. Dean Rothman had put it together. There were a few scientists there's 48 scientists who were part of the group, and a few of them actually kind of led the initiative and went to the dean, and the dean thought it was a fantastic idea. So he hosted a meeting in his office or a conference room, and then realized at one point there was really not enough chairs to go around. That's how many people are either doing clinical or basic science research related to the microbiome. So within the faculty, it's alive, vibrant, and definitely is on Dean Rothman's radar.
Well, that is good news indeed. Dr. Mullen, you mentioned that the food we eat has an impact on the microbes in our guts. And you said if we eat the wrong food, and I guess we can all kind of guess what the wrong food is. It would be sugar-sweetened beverages. It would be highly refined flour products, breads and crackers and cookies and cakes, Twinkies perhaps, who knows. It would be trans fats. What else would be the wrong foods? And then I'd like to ask you about the right foods.
Very good. There was a study that just came out yesterday where a little bit of an experiment where a gentleman had, just like the movie Super Size Me, he went to McDonald's 10 consecutive days, but they analyzed his microbiome before and after. And what do you think happened? The biodiversity of the microbiome dramatically adversely shifted within the 10 days. Now, there's another experiment that was done by a Dr. Gary Wu, University of Pennsylvania, where he gave the Western-style diet, and within 24 hours, there would start to be adverse changes in the microbiome. So I would say, again, the high sugary foods, the refined carbohydrates, even white bread and white pasta, saturated fats, perhaps even red meats. These are all things that can adversely shift the microbiome. And what are the right foods? Are how we feed the microbiome is just like you are taking a vacant lot and you're trying to prepare the soil, right? So you're trying to feed it the good foods and try to somewhat starve out the bad foods, right? So you don't want to give them starch and sugars and processed foods, but you want to start giving back the fermented foods like kefir and yogurts and miso soup and sauerkraut and pickles. You want to give back that vibrant bacteria and also the fertile ground, the prebiotic foods that lay down the soil and make the probiotic foods grow very rich. So prebiotic foods would include Jerusalem artichoke and asparagus and bananas. These are all things that are prebiotic in nature.
Now, I'm curious, how in the world do you determine what that microbiome is? You mentioned recent research in which they looked at how diet affects the microbiome. Are you basically looking at poop?
Yeah, you got to get yourself knee deep in it, right, to do this kind of work. But yeah, there is a few layers here to discuss. Yes, poop is one way to do it, and you're looking at what's floating around in the colon or the small intestine, digestive tract. But also there's something called the biofilm. There's many things that have biofilms, right? If you look at the pipes, you're piping at home, it's got the slimy coating of film bacteria that adhere to the surface. The same thing happens in our teeth, and that those bacteria are felt to be the ones that can lead to cavity formation, right? So the same thing happens in our gut. We have a very fine, filmy, slimy layer of bacteria, and they interact with the receptors from the immune system that kind of poke themselves up through the lining of the gut, and they interact, and they create an immune reaction. So they are the ones that kind of determine a lot of our immune responses, and what we analyze is what's kind of free-floating, as you said, in the poop.
Now, I'm fascinated with the idea that this is relatively new stuff here in Western medicine. But thousands of years ago, Chinese healers, Ayurvedic healers in India, Native American healers were thinking that the gut was important for good health. We kind of lost sight of that for 100, maybe 200 years in this country, and now we're kind of rediscovering what these ancient healers have known for centuries, if not millennia.
It's a true renaissance. I agree with you in that it's kind of like the old line by Rodney Dangerfield, the gut really got no respect for many years. And now it's starting to, you look at all the research, it seems to be the core of, or the second brain. It is the mechanism by which it controls inflammation, immunity, and things that determine outcomes of many diseases. So the gut is definitely a key player in health.
You're listening to Dr. Gerard Mullen. He's Associate Professor of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He's an internist, a gastroenterologist, and a nutritionist. Dr. Mullen co-directs the Johns Hopkins Hospital Nurse Practitioner Fellowship Program, and he directs the Celiac Disease Clinic. His book is The Gut Balance Revolution: Boost Your Metabolism, Restore Your Inner Ecology, and Lose the Weight for Good.
After the break, we'll learn more about probiotics.
What kinds of microorganisms are considered probiotics?
Are there any foods that contain probiotics?
We'll also talk about fermentation and consequently about flatulence.
Clindamycin increases the risk of C. diff. How can the balance of bacteria in the digestive tract be restored after this antibiotic?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. The number is 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. This is show 1023. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today on the People's Pharmacy, we're talking about the benefits of probiotics. We'll also discuss how we can use prebiotics to improve the health of our digestive tracts. And we'll find out about the influence of diet and what we should be eating to nourish our gut microbiome properly.
Our guest is Dr. Gerard Mullen. He's Associate Professor of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He's an internist, gastroenterologist, and nutritionist. Dr. Mullen co-directs the Johns Hopkins Hospital Nurse Practitioner Fellowship Program and directs the Celiac Disease Clinic. He's author of The Gut Balance Revolution: Boost Your Metabolism, Restore Your Inner Ecology, and Lose the Weight for Good. His website is thefoodmd.com.
Well, Dr. Mullen, one of the things that people are now interested in that's coming to the fore is probiotics. Can you tell us what probiotics are and why they're important?
And help us understand the confusion factor, because you can go into just about any supermarket in the country now and you'll see dairy products labeled with probiotics, and we have no idea what they are. They have long Latin names. You can buy pills with them. Some are refrigerated, some are not. Help us have a better understanding of how we can better influence our gut balance.
Well, probiotic really means probios, or to favoring life. And when we think about a probiotic, we think about it really in two forms, either food or supplements, dietary supplements, which is a discussion we can get into. But either way, you're taking in bacteria into your body, and in some ways a friendly yeast form. And those microorganisms are beneficial to our health, and that's what a probiotic is. It's taken in these beneficial microorganisms to have a beneficial outcome.
What kinds of microorganisms are we talking about?
Oh, we got hundreds and hundreds. The ones that I would really pay attention to are the lactobacilli, bifidobacter, certain strains of streptococcus, and one you may have heard about is Saccharomyces boulardii. It's a friendly yeast, and that one actually helps really keep our immune system healthy and regulated. I'm sure this you've had some interviews on yeast and its consequences on health, but this is one of them that actually helps you regulate your immunity and keep you in a very, let's say, normal state of immune health in the gut.
How do we know which ones we should be getting, how much we should be getting, what the right balance of them is? Especially for people who have, let's say, digestive tract problems, or maybe teenagers who've been taking antibiotics in the tetracycline class, not just for days, weeks, or months, but possibly for years to treat their acne. How do we get things back in balance?
I have to say that after looking at a lot of papers, hundreds, maybe thousands of papers, not a lot of them give you the doses that are optimal for the responses like we're discussing today, is that they talk more about the strains and the species and the outcomes. And I think that's a big question, is in any given individual, we're all different, right? We all have a similar microbiome to maybe 90%, right? But we're all different in many respects. Is that what are our individual needs at any given time, and how do we match that with a personalized mixture of probiotics? And that we don't have at this point in time, right? We can analyze our microbiome, and there's companies that do that commercially. And based on that, maybe you can see if you're deficient with certain bacteria or not, and then you can look for supplements that may match your deficiencies, but that is expensive and that is questionable whether that's going to benefit the person. So what happens more often than not, it becomes a little bit of a shotgun approach, is that if you throw enough probiotics at somebody, they're going to have some improvement or benefit. And the interesting thing about that is, like the old saying, more is not necessarily better. right? So we find that there's certain studies that side effects go up like bloating and the effects go down as doses increase. So the answer to your question is we don't know. And so what I try to do is promote food, right? Because food, if you're taking sauerkraut or pickles, if they're made the right way and they're not doused in high fructose corn syrup, if you're taking food, nature just seems to have a smart way of putting in the right amount. And I find people do better in those situations.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the foods that are rich in probiotics that we should all be including in our diets?
Well, everybody has, let's say we're going back to individual needs and individual taste. And somebody may not like kombucha like I do not, but I like kefir. I love kefir
What is
yogurts.
that?
It's very simple to make, actually. It's where you take these kefir grains, and they have beneficial bacteria and even the beneficial yeast, and you stir that up with, let's say, milk, and you let it sit out for 24 hours covered. And then after the 24 hours, you then strain it, and then you would drink it. And it has lots and lots of good, healthy microbes for your gut. And that's simple to make. It's not as, there are yogurt makers that are making it more simple nowadays. But I have to say is that if you're going to have yogurt, I know it's easy to go to the store, but there's not a lot of good bacteria in those yogurts. In fact, a lot of them are doused with sweeteners, which mitigates the beneficial effect. And your best yogurt is actually the homemade yogurt. That's your most potent yogurts.
So homemade yogurt, homemade kefir, those are dairy products. What about other foods that might be useful?
Pickles, right?
Now, you're not going to tell me I need to make my own pickles, are you?
Well, it used to be when I grew up years ago, the deli in town, they used to make their own, so that worked for me if you didn't want to make your own. But sauerkraut, miso soup, poi if you're...
miso soup too?
Yes, poi if you're out...
Well, you'd have to be in Hawaii to be eating poi, wouldn't you?
I have a friend who does that. She's a PhD nutritionist, and she loves it. Yeah, that's another probiotic food. So, in kimchi, right?
Okay, kimchi, that would be a Korean vegetable pickle, isn't it?
Correct.
Okay. So it sounds as though almost any kind of pickled vegetable might be useful.
Yes, and there's a variety that you can do.
Okay. But you're talking about actually letting them ferment rather than pickling them in sugar and vinegar.
Correct.
Well, let me ask you about side effects. You mentioned that people taking probiotic capsules could have some side effects if they took the wrong dose or possibly the wrong type. What about people eating these foods? I'm assuming that some people are going to find that these foods are compatible and other people are going to find that these foods are not so great.
I totally agree. I felt that way after having some kombucha. One of my good friends who's from Pakistan, and she was making kombucha for her and her husband, and try some, it's excellent. And I just had to get up. I'm sorry, but maybe some people feel a way about kefir. I've been recommending kefir, and I've had some friends come back and say not for me. So you're right. I mean, everybody has an individualized taste or tolerance to these things, but I have to tell you, this is a good way to address your health.
Now, a lot of the foods that you have mentioned are going to feed the bacteria in our digestive tracts. And one of the problems when bacteria are fed adequately, especially with high-fiber foods, is gas, flatulence, or farting, to be quite candid. So what do you do about flatulence and all of the quote-unquote healthy foods that you're talking about?
Excellent point. I think the problem is that we're seeing a lot of people who have what they say is gut dysbiosis or an imbalance in the bacterial quantity or placement of the bacteria. And one such example is called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Have you heard of that?
We have, but I would love to have you explain it, please.
Great. That is where the upper gut, which is normally relatively sterile, is overpopulated with bacteria, in particular anaerobes. And so when foods come into the gut, they are rapidly fermented and produce a lot of gas. So what you're describing is that if you're giving more and more of these fibrous foods that are fermentable, then those bacteria are misplaced and ready to ferment these foods, and then you're going to get a lot of gas. So what we try to do first in ameliorating this small bowel overgrowth is try to, like we mentioned before, is kind of starve out this overpopulated area. And that's when we start going into a program where we give foods that are less fermentable, control the terrain a bit, and then you gradually reintroduce these fermentable foods.
So which foods are less fermentable? And hasn't this bacterial overgrowth been linked to irritable bowel syndrome?
About 2/3 of patients with IBS or irritable bowel syndrome have been found to have this small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, also known as SIBO, S-I-B-O.
And which foods are less fermentable?
Well, if you go across the board, the ones that are less fermentable, if you want to pick fruits, grapes would be, pretty high on your list of things that are not as fermentable. Some people feel even bananas when they're not ripe. Doesn't mean you can have 5 bananas and not have that experience, but you want to just keep the quantity to a limit. Vegetables, as you go across, you want to also keep in mind that anything that's starchy is going to be highly fermentable. So you can have your salads. A lot of people like green, healthy salads, so that would be one area to keep in mind. You want to avoid the gluten-enriched grains. So quinoa would be a good alternative, right? I mean, gluten-free grains would be really excellent. And then just be wary of milk, because dairy products have lactose, and lactose really feeds these bacteria quite readily.
Dr. Mullen, one of the big problems that we quite frequently run across on our website would be comments from people who have been to their dentist and they've been prescribed an antibiotic such as clindamycin, and they end up ultimately with something called C. diff, something that gastroenterologists dread, of course, patients even more so. Not only is it uncomfortable, but it can in some cases be life-threatening. How do you restore the gut balance after something nasty like Clostridium difficile takes over?
Well, the first thing you try to do is prevent it. And there are studies showing that if you take Saccharomyces boulardii, that probiotic I was mentioning before, concomitantly with the Clinda, that can help prevent it from happening. So that's one way of doing it, is preventive medicine. But if you wind up getting the C. difficile, and likely the doctors will want to treat it with a number of different ways, which are unfortunately antibiotics, which will still disrupt the microbiome as much as they'll kill the C. diff perhaps. They'll also disrupt the microbiome further because they'll be friendly fire. You want to be able to eat the foods we had discussed during this program, right? The probiotic type foods. And also some prebiotic foods as well to try to really build up that soil for the good bacteria to repopulate and outnumber, if not competitively inhibit, the pathogenic spores of the C. difficile.
Now, when all else fails, we have heard that there is growing interest in what we'll call fecal transplants. Basically, you're getting good poop from a healthy person, and you're transplanting it into the digestive tract of somebody who has a dysfunctional digestive tract, dysbiosis, if you like. What's the latest?
Well, that's a very interesting hot area. The FDA kind of thought it was rapidly evolving, not being controlled. They actually put the brakes on it for a little while. And restricted it to just C. difficile because, of course, as you can imagine, people do all kinds of side experiments and or, marketing and or doing it illegally. So they put the brakes on it for a while. But with the C. difficile, you got to realize that could be a very nasty problem with over 500,000 people getting that annually. And it's becoming more and more, let's say, severe over time, right? I mean, people are getting more sick from it. So this is actually a way of disrupting that pathogenic microbiome, because in the dysbiosis and the C. difficile takes over, apparently when you put in a fecal transplant, that actually disrupts that pathogenic microbiome and provides an opportunity to kind of reestablish a fertile soil. And it's a powerful way of doing it, and it appears to work over 90% of the time.
Dr. Mullen, you've written about prebiotics. Can you tell us what prebiotics are and what their function is?
Yes, the prebiotics are these fibrous foods that we cannot break down ourselves, but the bacteria within us can. And it selectively stimulates the growth of the friendly bacteria, with bifidobacteria as the example they use for that definition.
What kinds of foods would we be eating if we were looking to increase our prebiotic intake?
I like asparagus. Asparagus is loaded with prebiotics.
I like asparagus too.
Yes. A lot of the vegetables are, like the cruciferous vegetables, are loaded with prebiotic fibers. Also, the green bananas, the unripened bananas, are loaded with prebiotic fibers. Do you like artichokes, Jerusalem artichokes? They have, and fruits. A lot of the fruits have prebiotic fibers.
Now,
so
artichokes
raspberries
and Jerusalem artichokes are two different things.
Right, but the Jerusalem artichokes really have much more than the artichokes, and even raspberries are very loaded with soluble fibers and prebiotic fibers, and it's a very fiber-rich fruit.
Oh, that's good to know. Dr. Mullen, can you help us understand what message you hope our listeners will be taking away from your book, Gut Balance Revolution: Boost Your Metabolism, Restore Your Inner Ecology, and Lose the Weight for Good?
Well, I think the main message is the fact that your gut is the controlling station for much of your body, and that if you want to influence your health and well-being, the best way to do it is by restoring gut health, gut function, and to do it through food as medicine. And what that book does, it walks the individual through a 3-step program to restore gut health and their gut ecology, and you'll be losing fat in the process. It's a nice perk.
That sounds good. Dr. Gerard Mullen, thank you very much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Dr. Gerard Mullen. He's Associate Professor of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He's an internist, a gastroenterologist, and a nutritionist. Dr. Mullen co-directs the Johns Hopkins Hospital Nurse Practitioner Fellowship Program, and he directs the Celiac Disease Clinic. He's author of The Gut Balance Revolution: Boost Your Metabolism, Restore Your Inner Ecology, and Lose the Weight for Good. His website is thefoodmd.com.
After the break, we'll hear about an unusual theory of what causes heartburn.
Heartburn sufferers are usually told to avoid fatty foods. But what if carbs are the main culprits?
Could bacteria in the small intestine be underlying the cause of many cases of heartburn? If so, what can be done about it?
Why not just take acid-suppressing drugs? We'll discuss their health risks.
Find out what foods can help control heartburn.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you're enjoying this People's Pharmacy podcast, why not head over to our website where you'll find a wealth of information on medications, conditions, home remedies, and ways to keep yourself healthy. You'll find it all at peoplespharmacy.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red X Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Foot Cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel soft and smooth. 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
To order a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1023. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today we've been talking about probiotics and the intestinal microbiome. Now we'll consider an innovative theory about how a microbiome gone awry could be causing heartburn. What can be done to overcome this problem?
Our guest, Dr. Norman Robillard, is a microbiologist and researcher who spent 20 years in the pharmaceutical industry before founding the Digestive Health Institute. His books include Fast Track Digestion Heartburn and Fast Track Digestion IBS.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Robillard.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Dr. Robillard, before we even get into the issues of heartburn that you're so passionate about, perhaps you can give us a sense of what is normal digestion and, perhaps even more importantly, the anatomy of the digestive tract. You know, we all learned it at one point, but I'm sure some of our listeners are going, what is he talking about when he says small intestine? So just start at the beginning.
Okay, well, let me see if I can state that succinctly. Of course, we eat food. We have to chew it up first, then we swallow it. It goes to our stomach where it's acted on. Well, first of all, there's amylase enzyme in our saliva that helps begin digesting starches. But then it goes to the stomach, it gets churned up with stomach acid and more enzymes, and eventually it leaves the stomach and enters the small intestine, where it's again acted on further by additional enzymes, and fats are solubilized by bile. So these three food groups, fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, must be broken down completely before they can enter the bloodstream, be absorbed. And so in normal digestion, that's a very efficient process. Some of the foods, particularly fibers and starches, we don't break down, but that's why we have all of these bacteria in our intestines. There's a small number of bacteria in the small intestine, and those help break down some sugars. And then in the large intestine is where we have the bulk of bacteria. There's some 100 trillion bacteria in our large intestine, and they're comprised of over 1,000 species. So why do we have that huge diversity and huge number of bacteria? Because the foods that we don't digest, these bacteria actually do digest. And when they break down all of these undigested foods, we derive energy from the fats that the bacteria produce, and we also benefit from vitamins that they produce. So it's a complex interaction between us and bacteria to fully break down the foods we digest. Now, some other things that our body does to optimize this digestive process is, first of all, having adequate enzymes and stomach acid. That not only helps digest our food, but it helps control too many bacteria growing in the small intestine.
Now, I'm going to ask you this, Dr. Robillard, because, our listeners are probably saying to themselves, he's a microbiologist. He's not a gastroenterologist. He's not a physician. How in the world did he get interested in the digestive tract? And I'm guessing it's because of all those bacteria in the colon.
Well, it's funny that I am a microbiologist, and I actually studied intestinal bacteria. But the real reason I got into this was because I'm a patient myself. I had gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD, for some 20 years as an adult. And I took the various medications for proton pump inhibitors, H2 blockers, and like a lot of people, these drugs didn't work for me. And so I suffered with this illness for quite some time, until I just happened to go on a low-carbohydrate diet. And within one day on that diet, my symptoms completely went away. And Dr. Yancey and Dr. Westman and other people at Duke had done a few studies showing that the same thing happened to other people. When they went on a low-carbohydrate diet, their symptoms went away. But I got very curious about that, and essentially I came up with a theory. And my theory was that carbohydrates, since those seem to be the key trigger of symptoms, that if carbohydrates were not being absorbed fully, that they could fuel like an overgrowth or a bloom of bacteria in the small intestine. And from growing bacteria in the laboratory for many years, I knew a couple of things about these intestinal bacteria. They tend to be saccharolytic, which means they prefer carbohydrates as a fuel source, and they make a tremendous amount of gas. 30 grams of unabsorbed carbohydrates can actually allow bacteria to produce 10 liters of hydrogen gas.
Wow. Now, wait a minute. 10 liters.
10 liters.
I'm thinking...
if you have a little bowl of, say, sweet potatoes or something, and all of a sudden you have all this gas.
I mean, 10 liters, I'm just thinking of, like a 1 liter bottle of Coke, and then I'm multiplying that times 10. In terms of volume, that's a lot of gas.
Well, it's a lot. And, of course, there are things going on to mitigate the gas buildup. It can be absorbed into your bloodstream and exhaled through your lungs. Other bacteria are metabolizing the hydrogen gas and then producing methane gas. But altogether, you have a lot of gas, hydrogen, methane, and carbon dioxide. And so my idea was this simple, is that if you eat too many carbs and you don't absorb them well, that you are going to have enough gas that will cause pressure in the small intestine that will likely translate into the stomach, because don't forget the pyloric sphincter between the stomach and the small intestine is not a true sphincter.
So what you're suggesting then is that there's this large amount of gas that's being produced in your small intestine that's then sort of backing up and forcing the area that's supposed to be closed between the stomach and the small intestine
Right. Exactly.
open, and I assume then that it's also forcing the little closure between the stomach and the esophagus open, and that's the problem with heartburn, right?
Exactly. In fact, it's interesting that the prevailing theory for what causes acid reflux for some 50 years was this thought of this LES, this lower esophageal sphincter valve on top of our stomach, relaxing, possibly in response to trigger foods or alcohol. And the reason that was such a solid theory was because they could actually measure this using a technique called manometry, this pressure-sensitive tube that measures the LES relaxing. And they could show over and over again it relaxes more in the case of people that have GERD. And they also could show that when it relaxed, that's when the acid was getting out into the esophagus. And so it seemed like an open and shut case. But to me, this idea didn't make sense based on this observation that removing carbs quells heartburn. What I find interesting is if you imagine this pressure buildup from bacteria from any of these carbs forcing this LES to open, it would look exactly the same by manometry. It would look like it were relaxing. And if we discuss the evidence for my theory, you'll see that this relaxation idea is inconsistent with the facts.
Now, Dr. Rebalance, you said something a moment ago about all of the bad foods. If you go to a gastroenterologist or almost any doctor and you say, I'm suffering from heartburn, from reflux, you will get a dietary regimen that pretty much forbids fatty foods, chocolate, coffee, no alcohol, anything fried, forget about it. And several years ago, we went searching for the evidence behind this diet, and we were surprised that there really hasn't been a lot of good research. What's the deal?
Well, it's interesting. You're right. There's a lot of things in this standard diet for GERD that are just not consistent with this approach of limiting carbs. And in fact, the Fast Track Digestion series focuses on 5 difficult-to-digest carbs: lactose, fructose, resistant starch, fiber, and sugar alcohols. So my idea is if you control those, you won't have reflux. So why all these other foods? First of all, newer research, larger studies have shown that fat does not cause acid reflux. And I think the reason fat got a bad rap was because there's always this term fatty and fried foods. Well, what are those really? It can be carbohydrates like, potatoes deep fried in oil. You could call that a fatty fried food. You could call chicken that's fried with a coating based on flour, wheat-based or corn-based flour and batter. So a lot of those fried foods actually contain a lot of carbohydrates.
Dr. Rebalance, you have described an intriguing theory about how bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine might contribute to heartburn. But do you have any evidence that this is actually happening?
Well, it's interesting that when I first started looking at the evidence after coming up with this theory, I was really doing my homework as a scientist. I really wanted to know what's wrong with this picture. What could I be missing? But it turns out that the evidence that I found was very consistent with the theory. For instance, if you're imagining that bacteria are producing all of this gas and it's driving acid reflux, you would expect to be a lot of pressure. And in fact, this has been very well studied, there is increased intragastric pressure and belching associated with GERD. It's well known, well studied, and well published. So it's consistent with the theory. You can also look at it another way. What if you were to inhibit bacteria? You should, according to my theory, reduce or stop acid reflux. And in fact, studies on antibiotics show, one study in the 90s looked at erythromycin, and it reduced symptoms, stopped reflux, and decreased acid in the esophagus. You can also look at the work of the fellows down at Duke using a low-carb diet, right? What are you doing? You're taking away fuel from these bacteria. And sure enough, low-carb diets reduce reflux and improve symptoms.
Now, Dr. Robillard, most gastroenterologists would say all of the bacteria are in the colon, the large intestines, and that's where the gas originates, and that's why you fart. But the small intestine, I mean, where are they coming from?
Well, it's interesting. In a normal situation, they're absolutely correct, right? We have some 100 trillion bacteria in our large intestine, and they can produce a lot of gas. But a well-known phenomenon is called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And that's when bacteria from the large intestine, where we have so many, move into the small intestine that should usually have very few bacteria, right? That's because that's where our own critical digestive process is occurring. So you don't want too much bacteria there. So there's really almost zero bacteria in the first part of the small intestine and a little bit more in the end of the small intestine. And that's the way it should be, right? And stomach acid and motility and our immune system, all these things are continuing to cleanse these bacteria in high numbers from our small intestine. But when those break down or you overfeed the bacteria, you can get a bloom in the small intestine. And that's what I believe is going on here.
So why not just take proton pump inhibitors? The drugs that so many people use for their heartburn or their GERD, like omeprazole or esomeprazole, Nexium.
Sure, and a lot of people do that. But if they're like me, half of the people that take PPIs and H2 blocking medicines don't get a benefit from them. They don't work. And there's some other issues and problems with those drugs. They have a number of side effects: diarrhea, muscle weakness, skin reactions, headache, and many others. But the real concern for me is the health risks. More and more health risks are being linked to these drugs. And most of them have to do with the fact that they eliminate stomach acid, right? And so not only do you not digest meats and proteins as well, but you also have poor vitamin and mineral absorption. Things like iron, magnesium, calcium, vitamin B12. And so you can end up with dangerously low blood levels of magnesium. The FDA just issued a warning on that recently. You can also get bone fractures from calcium malabsorption, and this has been very well studied in people taking these drugs. Another problem is anemia from the B12 malabsorption.
Dr. Robillard, let's talk a little bit about the diet, because I can imagine people listening to us and tearing their hair out saying, what will I do if I stop taking my proton pump inhibitor, whether it's omeprazole or lansoprazole? I'm going to have horrible heartburn. But how could they control it by diet? That's the first question. And then I have a second question, which is, how are your dietary recommendations different from the ones that you'll find in other diets, like the wheat belly diet, like the modified Atkins diet, like the paleo diet, that are also popular nowadays?
Okay, well, that's a lot to answer.
It is. It's two questions.
Yeah. So our diet really focuses on controlling excessive gut fermentation by limiting lactose, fructose, resistant starch, fiber, and sugar alcohols, those 5 components. And we do it by a measurement called the fermentation potential. I derived this equation based on the glycemic index to quantify the carbohydrates that are most likely to be not digested and available for fermentation. So our diet is based on fermentation potential.
Well, I was surprised to see that, your fermentation potential, your FP for soybeans, is pretty high, as is, baked beans. Surprise, surprise. So, there are a lot of products out there that have a high fermentation potential.
Well, there are, and that's probably why, 60 million people suffer at least once a week with chronic acid reflux.
I mean, like rice crackers, for example. I mean, who would have imagined that they would be a problem?
Right. Well, it depends on which type of rice it is, right? Jasmine rice, sweet sticky rice, the Asian short grain rice, those are all have low FPs because they have amylopectin starch. But any of the rices with amylose are going to have high FPs as well as the products made from them. So I think now that I've created the system and more people are reading the book, I think that we'll find more foods being developed that have low FP because I really believe that's the secret.
Dr. Norman Robillard, we want to thank you very much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to Dr. Norman Robillard. He's a microbiologist and founder of the Digestive Health Institute. He's author of Fast Track Digestion Heartburn and Fast Track Digestion IBS. His website is digestivehealthinstitute.org. We have a link from our website.
We spoke earlier with Dr. Gerard Mullen. He's Associate Professor of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He's an internist, a gastroenterologist, and a nutritionist. Dr. Mullins co-directs the Johns Hopkins Hospital Nurse Practitioner Fellowship Program and directs the Celiac Disease Clinic. He's author of The Gut Balance Revolution, Boost Your Metabolism, Restore Your Inner Ecology, and Lose the Weight for Good. His website is thefoodmd.com, and there is a link to it from our website.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski is the engineer. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Red X Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Extra Care 20 Cream with 20% urea for extra skin protection. The number is 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
To order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1023. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit our site, you can check out information on prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. Share your own experience and your thoughts on today's show.
And when you go to the website, you can also sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. You'll never miss another People's Pharmacy program again, and you can also share it with a friend. It's all there at peoplespharmacy.com. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to the People's Pharmacy.